Burgess here with Music Marketing TV. Today we're going to be looking at using the Pro-C to process a kick drum. Something pretty basic, but hopefully you'll walk away from here with a little bit deeper of an understanding of what's going on. So when you are compressing a kick drum, a single sample is different than processing a drum bus, especially one that was an actual recorded drum bus where there's variation between the samples. In this case, because it's a recording, every kick is unique. But here, every single kick is exactly the same. So the way we process this is going to be a bit different. And grabbing a compressor for something like this just involves, it's a little bit more straightforward in some ways, but in other ways, it's easy to listen to tutorials on how to process recorded sounds and use that on sampled sounds, and it often isn't exactly the results. With recorded sounds, the kick drum's levels may vary, and you're trying to get that to be more consistent. You are very much sort of doing some level processing in terms of trying to get a more consistent, balanced mix versus when you're processing a sample with a compressor, you're typically trying to change the characteristic of the kick pretty much exclusively, because if you want to change the level, you can just write a softer kick drum, or if you want it to be softer there, or you could just bring down the level. You should never need to use a compressor to do that. It shouldn't be an issue. If it is, you've used your samples in a way where it'd be better if you just went and rewrote how you did that. Sort of like just playing well. Ideally, the musician just plays really great and you don't have to worry about compression that much in terms of a corrective volume level issue kind of a thing. So I'm going to be looking at it from this perspective. So the Pro-C 2, there's this upper window. You've got your knee here. This shows you what's coming in and how the compression will take place. And then you've also got over here, right, the level area. So we can see here the kick drum is coming on in, and we can see the gain reduction here. And I do have auto gain on. I tend to leave this on. If you have it off, it just won't apply any makeup gain, and the sound would just get softer. It's easier to make comparisons with this on. So I highly recommend leaving it on. If you bring up the side chain, you can see specifically what will be triggering this input. And there is a small balancing act you need to do. So the ones that I typically look at first is I don't worry too much about the threshold if you just leave it at the default position at the beginning. Or the algorithm. Instead, our main concerns will be, what do you want triggering it? And what do you want the threshold to trigger at? You need it to start triggering. And this is like, going to sort of say how much it works with the threshold and the ratio. And then the attack and release are, of course, going to be our hotspots. So the first big concept here is let's get it triggering first. Let's just make sure it's triggering. And we see it's going well past where we set our threshold. It's this dotted line here. So that's fine. I'm going to lower it even a little bit more, just so we're a little bit more extreme here at the beginning. And you can see the difference with our new output. It's this like brighter stuff, and the background is what it was. So we have turned it down. So the first big thing is if you have your attack all the way up on a kick sample especially, it is going to just kill the click of your kick. And this is something, it's called, like, some people call it a squashed sound. There's nothing here. The initial hit has been removed. And if you're doing it, so this is where the two types of compression come into play that I talked about earlier. Like we're compressing a sample. We are ideally not trying to reduce the level of this. So the level of the initial click when it comes in, like here, should not be an issue. It should already be where you want it, okay? That's something some people will grab a compressor to just turn the kick down. You could always just, do that if it's too loud. So when we look at this, the initial click is something we want to preserve because that's where the initial hit happens. If you're trying to remove it because it's too loud, this move won't work, and it's better if you just move a fader. But let's go ahead and bring this back. We want some of that to come through. So we're going to move our attack back. I find usually in the realm of 25 milliseconds to be a good starting position. So then we have some more of that click. If you go further, it'll become more obvious. And you can see we're just shaving off on that initial hit some of the some of the sound. So I quite like that. If we go down even, so that's totally squashed. No click at all now. And then there we get some of our click back. So once we have this figured out, what we could do is our next thing we want to turn our attention to is the release. So with samples, you need to make sure your compressor can get back to that initial starting point before the next hit happens. And this is going to depend on what material you've written, and you're going to sort of have to figure this out. But right now it's just 4 to the floor. We just need to make sure this release can get back up to where it needs to be so that we can have that initial click. If our release is too long, it's going to do it as if the attack was really fast, because the gain reduction will still be really low. You see that? And so in essence, we've sort of just pushed everything down. So that's not jiving. So you don't want it too fast, because you can get other types of issues. But in this case, you want it fast enough. And the mode you pick here will have some influence on how these work. But in general, you just want to make sure that the release is fast enough that it's got time. If you have a very fast attack and a very fast release, what ends up happening is it tries to do the attack and the release like right next to each other, and you get this really crazy distortion that can happen. A lot of the modes actually will filter that out to some extent, so you don't have to worry too much. But if you start to hear that, chances are your attack and release are just a touch too fast or too close to each other. Since our attack is longer, our release can be quite fast and it won't be an issue in this case. But you can see we just go right back up, just resetting before each kick. And as a sample, that's totally fine. And now here is where we can begin to look at this part that gets shaved off. It's going to have an impact on how sort of clicky it is. So if you bring the threshold way down, that's going to just extend where it goes because the threshold's lower, as you can see. And it's much steeper here. So this is very, very snappy. And this might be something you do in parallel and mix in by bringing up the dry control. So you might have a really hard snap, then mix it in with the original, and then turn the whole thing down with the fader on the track. And that could be a way of doing it just in parallel. And then, of course, if you want to influence how sharply this happens, besides the threshold, which sort of extends it, you can change the ratio and the style. So the ratio, if you have it much higher, right, it's going to be a lot less forgiving and a lot sharper. If we have it, let's go for something real light, like maybe 1 to 2 to 1 or whatever. You can see versus. So that's a little bit on how you might select these controls. The knee can also give us quite a bit of control over the snap. So I have here a setting that really just crunches it and pushes it down. And we've got here a hard knee and a soft knee. This isn't something I find that often impacts it very much. Generally, a soft knee is, a little more transparent, and the algorithm you picked is going to influence how the knee works. But what really can give us a lot more control over this initial snap is the range. So if you have the range all the way off, you can see it's basically not on. And then as you turn the range on, it begins to turn on, but it leaves this upper stuff more or less linear. So we're able to sort of control what happens to the high end versus not the high end, but the louder stuff and the softer stuff. So if you have this all the way off, we can sort of dial this in until we get the precise amount of snap that we want. So you can see we can sort of decide where it's going to go. This is one of the times where I find the range to be very useful. Like it's usually, pretty handy, but in these cases where you're trying to shape, we're basically doing transient shaping to some extent. This is fantastic. Great tool for that. And there you have it. That's the basic steps I go through when I'm initially taking a kick drum and trying to just get a little more snap out of it. So let's just start from the beginning here and just do a quick recap. So here we are, we're at the beginning. We got nothing coming in. I'm not going to worry about the side chain triggering anything because the kick is already very prominently down here. So it's going to trigger the threshold primarily. So I'm just going to remove that section. I am going to go ahead and set my threshold. maybe just a smidge lower. I've got auto gain on, that's totally fine. I'm going to bring the attack up some till I find something I like a little bit more. I'm going to bring the the ratio up a little bit, so much tighter ratio. I'm going to bring the range back and just listen to it come in. Somewhere right around there. Pull in the release a touch. Not a super important move there. And you can, of course, mess with the style. Sometimes you'll be quite surprised at what some of these might put out there. Like we'll try punch, opto. I think I'm going to stay with punch. Oh, yeah, that's pretty nice. And then let's go ahead and bring in the dry sound a little bit to even it out. And let's go ahead and pull back the fader just a touch. And of course, this is going, we're hitting -9 dBFS. So this is pretty okay, but in a mix, I might shoot it for a little bit lower if I'm using the kick as my first element I bring in. And let's go ahead and hear it bypassed as before. That's after. So a little bit more tight, a little bit more control, and that is just sort of my compression philosophy when it comes to dealing with samples versus actual recordings. When you're doing recordings, it's a lot of the same steps, but everything sort of varies a little bit more. Sidechain and picking what triggers it comes into the game a bit more. And the range, actually most of the other stuff is pretty dang similar. There is a little bit more level-minded control, trying to even out the level in general, where here we're pretty much entirely concerned with the envelope of the initial hit. If you have any questions about this, feel free to let me know, subscribe, and hit that bell icon for future videos, and have a blessed day.